In a small, dimly lit room deep inside the NKVD headquarters, a man tightens the straps of his dark leather apron. The smell of oil and gunpowder hangs heavy in the air. On the table beside him, lined with surgical precision, rests a collection of Walther pistols, freshly cleaned and ready. Outside, footsteps echo down the corridor. Another prisoner is brought in. Without hesitation, the man steps forward. He doesn't shout, doesn't sneer, doesn't even look angry. He simply presses the muzzle of the pistol to the back of the prisoner's head and fires. One shot, then another, then another. Hour after hour, night after night, he repeats the ritual. His record-keeping is immaculate, his routine efficient, almost mechanical. When one pistol overheats, he replaces it with another. When his arm grows tired, he keeps going. There is no pause, no reflection, only the next name on the list. That man was Vasily Blokhin, the chief executioner of Stalin's secret police. A man who may have personally killed more people with his own hands than any other in recorded history. Not a soldier, not a serial killer, but a highly ranked state employee, performing his duty with chilling precision. Vasily Mikhailovich Blokhin was born on January 19, 1895, in a small village in the Yaroslavl governorate, into a poor Russian peasant family. His childhood was unremarkable, days spent tending livestock, hands hardened by farm work and cold winds. From 1905 to 1910, he worked as a shepherd, then moved to Moscow in search of a better life, finding work as a bricklayer. It was a modest existence, but one that taught him discipline, silence, and obedience, qualities that would soon define his fate. When World War I broke out, Blokhin was drafted into the Imperial Army. He served without distinction, but without trouble either. The kind of soldier superiors appreciated, quiet, obedient, and uncomplaining. When the Russian Empire collapsed and the revolution tore the country apart, Blokhin watched from the sidelines at first. But by autumn of 1918, he chose his side, the Bolsheviks. Whether out of ideology or survival instinct, no one can say. But from that moment, his loyalty to the new regime was absolute. He joined the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, the predecessor of the NKVD, serving in the 62nd Battalion in Stavropol. Commanders noticed him not for brilliance, but for something far more valuable in their eyes: reliability and ruthlessness. Blokhin was the man who never refused a job, no matter how grim. Arrests, interrogations, torture. He carried them out with fanatical precision. Unlike many of his comrades, he seemed to take no pleasure, no disgust, just duty. That made him invaluable. As one officer reportedly said, "He works like a machine." Blokhin's reputation spread quickly through the corridors of the early Soviet security organs. By 1924, his hard work and unflinching obedience earned him a powerful new title: Commissar of the Special Department under the OGPU Collegium. In plain terms, he now had the authority not only to sign death sentences, but to carry them out himself. No record survives of what he felt when he executed his first victim. Perhaps there was hesitation, perhaps not. What is certain is that his hand did not tremble. From that moment on, killing became his profession. Blokhin approached his work with the same diligence others reserved for art or science. He was punctual, methodical, discreet. He kept no unnecessary records, drew no attention, and never questioned orders. To his superiors, he was the ideal servant of the state, efficient, loyal, and utterly without conscience. And so, the quiet peasant boy from a small village became something else entirely: the perfect executioner in service of the Soviet machine. By the late 1920s, Vasily Blokhin's rise was complete. In 1926, he was appointed commandant of the OGPU, the position that made him chief executioner at the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow, the beating, secretive heart of Soviet state terror. What began as dirty work in the shadows was now a full-time profession. He was no longer just one of many executioners. He was the one everyone feared, and the one the system needed most. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was turning into an empire of fear. The machinery of repression was expanding, and Blokhin stood at its core. In the basement chambers of the Lubyanka, he would soon turn killing into a bureaucratic, almost industrial process. Blokhin's role was not limited to pulling the trigger. He organized and led a special team known as the Special Group, a cadre of professional executioners, selected from among the most loyal and psychologically resilient members of the secret police. Their job was simple, if that word can apply: to make people disappear efficiently. Even among hardened NKVD men, few could withstand the work for long. Alexander Yemelyanov, one of Blokhin's subordinates, once recalled the horrific toll it took. "We drank vodka until we blacked out. The work was unbearable. The fatigue was crushing. We washed with cologne up to our waists to scrub off the smell of blood and gunpowder. Even dogs would avoid us. If they barked, they did so from a distance." Yemelyanov didn't last. Like many others in Blokhin's group, he broke. The official report stated that he was retired for illness, schizophrenia, caused by prolonged operational work. Others met even darker ends. Some drank themselves to death, others committed suicide, and some simply disappeared, victims of the very machine they had served. One of the few to survive into the 1940s was Pyotr Mago, another member of the special group. He used to train new recruits, explaining the routine with chilling detachment. The condemned man's hands are tied behind with wire. You lead him forward with the revolver in your hand. When you reach the place, a floor covered with sawdust, you press the muzzle to the back of the head, pull the trigger, and kick him hard so the blood doesn't spray your tunic. Saves the wife from having to wash it again. Mago himself was forced into retirement in 1940 due to alcoholism and died a year later of liver cirrhosis. By then, almost all of Blokhin's colleagues were dead, insane, or disgraced. He alone remained, silent, obedient, and unshaken. The survivors whispered that he was born without a soul. When Stalin's Great Terror peaked in 1937 to 1938, Blokhin's work reached its horrific zenith. Each night, the basement at Lubyanka and other execution sites like the Butovo firing range became assembly lines of death. Prisoners were processed in near-total silence. Blokhin designed the procedure himself. The prisoner's name was checked, the sentence confirmed. The condemned led into a soundproof chamber and shot in the back of the head with a German Walther pistol, chosen for its reliability and lower recoil compared to Soviet models. He dressed the part of a man performing a grim ritual. Leather cap, long leather apron, leather gloves reaching up to the elbows. The outfit was practical. It kept the blood from soaking his uniform, but it also gave him an inhuman appearance, like a butcher of men. Behind him stood a hose to wash away the blood between executions. Nearby was a small table with vodka and cigarettes. After each night's work, sometimes hundreds of executions in a single week, Blokhin and his men would drink heavily. It wasn't celebration. It was the only way to keep the ghosts quiet. Among those he personally executed were some of the most prominent figures of the Soviet state. Myself, Mikhail Tukmarshal, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Iona Yakir, Robert Eidemann, August Kork, and others. Generals, ministers, intellectuals, and once loyal Bolsheviks accused of treason. Stalin wanted them erased swiftly and discreetly. Blokhin delivered. Each trigger pull was an act of obedience. Each corpse was another brick in the fortress of Stalin's paranoia. Blokhin's survival during those years was no accident. The Soviet secret police devoured its own. Yagoda, Yezhov, and later Beria all rose and fell in bloody succession. But Blokhin stayed. He knew how to serve. He had executed under Genrikh Yagoda, continued under Nikolai Yezhov, and adapted once more when Lavrenti Beria took over. Every time a purge claimed the previous boss, Blokhin simply saluted the new one and carried on. In 1939, Beria tried to remove him. A report accused Blokhin of anti-Soviet activity, a convenient pretext that had sent countless others to their graves. The evidence was supposedly ironclad, but then Stalin intervened. Beria later described the moment himself. Comrade Stalin disagreed with me, saying, "People like Blokhin should not be eliminated. They do the dirty work." Then he called the head of his personal guard, Nikolai Vlasic, and asked whether Blokhin took part in the executions and whether he should be arrested. Vlasic confirmed he did participate and spoke well of him. The matter was closed. That short exchange likely saved Blokhin's life. Stalin personally shielded him, because men like Blokhin were indispensable. How could anyone perform thousands of executions, night after night, for years? Those who knew Blokhin outside the NKVD described a man of contradictions. His housekeeper, Shura Tikhonova, called him cruel and evil. She recalled how he often came home drunk at dawn, reeking of alcohol and gunpowder. He was short-tempered and violent when drunk, cold and expressionless when sober. Yet, he had a passion. One strange, almost tender obsession. Horses. He adored them. He collected books about them, over 700 volumes in his personal library. He read about their anatomy, their training, their grace. To him, horses represented purity and strength, everything his own life had destroyed. It was as if that obsession was his only tether to humanity. But even that small refuge could not erase what his knights had done to him. He aged quickly, his health deteriorating under the constant strain and alcohol. Yet his efficiency never faltered. The system depended on his steadiness, and he never gave Stalin a reason to doubt him. By the early 1940s, Blokhin had become the face of Soviet execution, though his name was known only to a handful of people in the Kremlin. To the rest of the world, his existence was a secret. But behind closed doors, everyone in the NKVD knew who he was and what he was capable of. When Stalin ordered the elimination of enemies of the people, Blokhin was the hand that carried it out. He executed until dawn, sometimes hundreds in a single night, then slept briefly before returning for another round. His life was regimented like clockwork. Orders, executions, reports, vodka, silence. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and was feared even by his superiors. In a regime built on fear, Blokhin was its purest instrument. When new recruits arrived, they were told, "If you can't handle it, you'll end up like the others, broken or gone." Only Comrade Blokhin endures. For all his brutality, Blokhin saw himself not as a monster, but as a soldier. A man doing his duty for his leader and his country. He was proud of his rank, his medals, his private dacha. He once reportedly boasted that he held the highest military decoration ever awarded to a man whose job was execution. He was, in the words of one NKVD officer, the perfect servant of Stalin's terror, loyal, silent, efficient. When Stalin trusted him with the most secret orders, he obeyed without hesitation. And soon, those orders would reach a level of horror that even by his standards was extraordinary. Because in 1940, Blokhin would be sent to carry out one of the largest single mass executions by one man in human history. The Katyn Massacre, where almost 7,000 Polish officers were shot one by his own hand. But that would be the next act of his story. By 1940, Vasily Blokhin's bloody career reached its terrible peak. The Soviet Union had invaded eastern Poland the previous year, and thousands of captured Polish officers, soldiers, policemen, professors, priests, were held in prison camps across the USSR. When Stalin signed the secret order to liquidate them, it was Blokhin who was called upon to make it happen. He was sent to the Ostashkov camp, near the town of Kalinin, today known as Tver. There, more than 6,000 Polish prisoners awaited their fate. What would happen in the basement of the NKVD headquarters would later be known to the world as the Katyn Massacre, one of the darkest crimes of the 20th century. 50 years later, in 1991, Dmitry Tokarev, the former head of the NKVD in the Kalinin region, testified before Soviet military prosecutors. His memories were chilling. Blokhin gave the signal, saying, "Well, let's begin." He put on his special clothing, a brown leather hat, a long leather coat, and brown gloves that reached above the elbows. It left a great impression on me. For the first time, I saw a real executioner. It wasn't an exaggeration. The execution chamber had been transformed into a killing factory. The walls were padded to muffle the sound of gunfire. The floor was sloped and covered with sawdust so the blood could drain away. A hose was nearby to wash it clean between victims. Night after night, trucks arrived with prisoners from the camp, carrying around 250 men every night. They were told they were being processed for transfer or release. Instead, they were led into the basement, one by one. Their identities were checked carefully against a list. A clerk confirmed the sentence. Then, Blokhin or one of his men would grab the condemned by the shoulder, steer him into a small adjoining room, and execute him with a single shot to the back of the head. The whole process took no more than 3 minutes per man. Then another, and another. For 10 hours a night. Blokhin personally carried out the executions, rotating through a small team of assistants. To maintain order, vodka was freely distributed. The men drank heavily before, during, and after the work. But only Blokhin seemed unfazed. Cold, efficient, unshakably calm. When one of his subordinates faltered, Blokhin would step in wordlessly, fire the shot himself, and move on. The techniques were precise, honed through years of practice. Experienced executioners aimed upward and slightly to the side of the neck, so the bullet would exit through the eye or mouth, minimizing blood spray. A shot straight to the back of the head, one survivor later explained, causes massive bleeding. More than a liter of blood can pour out. But a sideways shot leaves only a trickle. Each night, Blokhin's group killed around 250 men, their bodies dragged through a side door, loaded into waiting trucks, and transported to the Mednoye forest, where mass graves had already been dug. The operation lasted 28 nights. By the end, Blokhin himself had executed roughly 7,000 Polish prisoners, one bullet at a time, a record unmatched in human history for individual, personally performed killings. When the final prisoner fell, the team gathered for what Blokhin called a farewell celebration. There was vodka, music, and grim laughter. He distributed small rewards to the participants: a month's salary, a pistol, a bicycle, a phonograph. Then he returned to Moscow as if nothing had happened. For his exceptional service, Blokhin was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Soviet Union's highest military honors, and a generous cash bonus. To the outside world, his name meant nothing, buried in secrecy. But within the NKVD, he was quietly recognized as a legend of efficiency. The Soviet state treated the Katyn operation not as an atrocity, but as an administrative success, a model of clean, efficient work. Blokhin had done exactly what was asked of him. No witnesses, no noise, no mistakes. In his personnel file, there were no reprimands, no notes of doubt or hesitation. Just promotions, awards, and praise for exemplary discipline. He had completed his task without a single known error. To the men above him, Stalin, Beria, and the inner circle, that was all that mattered. Blokhin's list of awards eventually became long enough to fill a page. The Order of the Red Banner, the Order of the Red Star, several for meritorious service medals, and other honors. He lacked only one: the title Hero of the Soviet Union, a distinction he privately believed he deserved. And perhaps, in Stalin's eyes, he did. After all, he had accomplished what even mass murderers rarely do, killing thousands, one, by his own hand, without ever questioning why. Today, the basement where the executions took place still exists in Tver. The padded walls are gone, but the drain in the floor remains. For decades, the Soviet government denied the massacre, blaming the Nazis instead. Only in 1990 did Moscow officially admit the NKVD's role. When Tokarev described Blokhin's demeanor during those nights, he recalled something that haunted him to the end of his life. He never raised his voice, never showed emotion. It was as if he was doing some ordinary office work. That was Vasily Blokhin's genius, and his damnation. He turned killing into routine, death into procedure, horror into habit. He was not driven by ideology or hatred. He was driven by duty, and by the unspoken rule of the Soviet terror machine. Do what you are told. Ask no questions. For the regime, he was indispensable. For history, he remains one of its darkest figures, a man who killed more people with his own hands than any other in recorded history. When the war ended, Vasily Blokhin returned to his life of shadows. There were no celebrations, no public thanks, no songs about his heroism. His face was unknown to the public, his name erased from all records. And yet, inside the NKVD, he was considered a model of efficiency. Stalin himself once called him a man who gets things done. For his decades of service, Blokhin was rewarded with high honors: the Order of the Red Banner, medals for bravery, and the rare distinction of a general's rank. He had, in bureaucratic terms, served the state impeccably. But history does not reward executioners forever. When Stalin died in 1953, the machinery of terror suddenly froze. The man who had signed millions of death warrants was gone, and his subordinates began to turn on one another. Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's feared trust, briefly seized power and began to clean house. Among the names he reviewed was Vasily Blokhin. At 58 years old, the once untouchable executioner was quietly removed from service, officially due to illness. There would be no trial, no punishment, just silence and exile. Blokhin retreated to his small dacha near Moscow, where he lived alone, surrounded by the only things he seemed to genuinely love: his horses. For a time, he lived comfortably on a generous pension, as though the ghosts of thousands did not follow him. But the new Soviet leadership had no interest in honoring the men who had embodied Stalin's darkest years. In 1954, the state stripped Blokhin of all his ranks and awards. His medals were taken, his pension revoked. Overnight, the man once praised for exceptional loyalty became a relic and an embarrassment. What followed was quiet, but grim. Neighbors recalled seeing him less and less. The man who once stood firm in front of his victims now seemed broken, hollowed out by years of mechanical killing. In 1955, Vasily Blokhin, the most prolific executioner in recorded history, died by his own hand. The exact details remain uncertain. Soviet archives listed it simply as suicide. For decades, his name vanished completely from Soviet history. It was as if he had never existed. No grave, no mention, no legacy. Only later, after the fall of the USSR, did the truth begin to surface. That one man, hidden in the machinery of Stalin's terror, had personally murdered more human beings than any serial killer who ever lived. Today, historians remember Vasily Blokhin with a single, chilling title: the most prolific executioner in history. His exact number of victims will never be known. Some records suggest around 10,000, others as many as 55,000. Numbers so large they stop meaning anything at all. Just statistics. just paperwork, just names crossed off lists. And yet, Blokhin's final resting place tells a story as disturbing as his life. He is buried in Moscow's prestigious Novodevichy Cemetery, the resting place of poets, scientists, generals, and national heroes. His grave is polished, well-tended, adorned with flowers. At first glance, it could belong to a man honored for his service to the nation. But beneath that marble lies the executioner of Stalin's terror, a man responsible for ending more lives than any single killer in modern history. And cruelly, some of those buried not far from him may be among his own victims. He is not alone there. Another NKVD executioner, Pyotr Mago, credited with up to 10,000 killings, also rests in the same cemetery. Both men buried with honors, as heroes. Their graves stand as monuments not to bravery, but to a system where killing became a job, a bureaucratic routine, stamped and signed. Vasily Blokhin never killed for pleasure or profit. He didn't act out of personal hatred. He killed because the state told him to. And that, the quiet obedience of evil, may be the most terrifying motive of all.